Imagine standing at the edge of your 95th birthday, looking back at the exact seat you are sitting in right now. What if the heaviest weight you will ever carry on your deathbed isn't the mistakes you made, but the haunting ghost of a version of you that never existed? Every single day, millions of people look at the calendar and perform a silent act of psychological sabotage. They whisper to themselves that they are too old, too late, or too tired to begin. We treat time as a linear prison, completely blind to the fact that the bars are entirely manufactured by our own minds. At 18, we fear we missed the starting line. At 30, we fear the race is already lost. But what if your current age is not a countdown to your irrelevance, but the exact camouflage you are using to avoid the terror of your own potential? Welcome to Shadow Psychology DD. Today, we break the illusion of the universal timeline and uncover the brutal science of why you are staying paralyzed in a life you never actually wanted. Idea 1. The fear of aging and the illusion of a lost perfect time. A real-life phenomenon. Look around the digital landscape today, and you will witness a bizarre biological paradox. A teenager at 18 stands frozen at the gates of adulthood, genuinely convinced that because they haven't founded a tech startup or mastered a complex art form, they are already a structural failure. Simultaneously, a professional at 30 staring at a glowing spreadsheet experiences a sudden spike of cortisol, believing that switching careers now would be an act of social suicide because the concrete of their life has already dried. From the perspective of an outside observer, this looks like madness. How can both the child and the mature adult arrive at the exact same neurological destination, the absolute certainty that they have run out of time? We observe this across every socioeconomic boundary. Individuals voluntarily withdrawing from their deepest ambitions, retiring their passions before they even deploy them, all under the psychological comforting blanket of the phrase, "it is simply too late." A real scientific or psychological concept, this collective paralysis is driven by two powerful interlocking psychological mechanisms: chronophobia and the status quo bias. Chronophobia is not merely the fear of time passing. It is the neurotic, existential anxiety regarding the perceived speed and insufficiency of time left within a specific lifespan. When combined with the status quo bias, our overwhelming emotional preference for the current state of affairs, the brain engages in a brilliant defensive maneuver. The human mind inherently perceives any major behavioral shift as a high-risk threat to its caloric and social stability. To avoid the pain of potential failure and the immense energy required to learn something new, the subconscious mind weaponizes your age. It converts a simple biological number into an unassailable logical argument. By convincing yourself that you are too old, your brain successfully rationalizes its own cowardice, allowing you to remain comfortable in your dissatisfaction while completely dodging the vulnerability of being a beginner again. A specific experiment or historical story is evidence. To understand how deeply this illusion is embedded in the human psyche, we must examine a profound historical anomaly involving the conceptualization of time and human longevity. In early 19th century psychological observations, researchers noted that individuals who lived within rigid, highly structured societal timelines experienced significantly higher rates of existential despair compared to those in fluid environments. Consider the famous psychological profile of individuals tracking their life milestones during the Industrial Revolution. As societies began attaching rigid economic values to specific ages, defining exactly when a worker should master a trade, marry, or retire, the human mind began practicing what psychologists call anticipatory regret. Humans were no longer evaluating their current capabilities. They were simulating a future state of failure based entirely on an arbitrary societal clock. A famous example lies in the archives of classical musicianship, where thousands of technically gifted individuals abandoned their instruments in their late 20s simply because they did not match the childhood prodigy timeline popularized by the archetype of Mozart. They chose total cessation over the perceived humiliation of an asynchronous timeline. Long-term consequences. The long-term consequence of bowing to chronophobia is a catastrophic psychological state known as living death or systemic desensitization to regret. When an individual repeatedly uses their age as a barrier to execution, the neural pathways associated with curiosity and risk-taking begin to atrophy. Year after year, the gap between your authentic self, the one that wishes to create, build, or learn, and your functional self widens. This creates a chronic, low-level internal friction known as structural cognitive dissonance. You begin to develop a bitter, cynical worldview, projecting your own self-imposed limitations onto the younger generation around you. Eventually, you reach a state of total learned helplessness, where you actively participate in the maintenance of your own prison, looking at the passage of time not as an open canvas of execution, but as a slow, agonizing countdown to an empty finish line. Idea 2, the law of accumulation and the trap of misinterpreting delay. A real-life phenomenon, we must now confront the core narrative that dictates our stagnation, the profound mathematical illiteracy of our own emotions. Consider a person at 40 who deeply desires to pivot into entrepreneurship, or perhaps a 45-year-old who wishes to study a complex scientific discipline. They look at the textbook or the business plan, and within minutes they shut it down. Their internal dialogue is incredibly predictable. By the time I master this, I will be 50. What is the point? This thought process is a profound optical illusion. They are treating the age of 50 as a sudden cataclysmic termination point where life completely ceases to possess value. They completely fail to realize that whether they choose to study or not, The age of 50 is arriving with absolute mathematical certainty. The time will pass regardless of their behavior. The only variable within human control is who you will be when that date finally arrives on the horizon. A real scientific or psychological concept, this cognitive error is a manifestation of hyperbolic discounting combined with the end of history illusion. Hyperbolic discounting is our cognitive tendency to choose immediate smaller rewards, such as the comfort of not feeling stupid today, over massive long-term rewards, like being a master of a craft a decade from now. This is intensely compounded by the end of history illusion, a psychological phenomenon where individuals, regardless of their current age, acutely recognize that they have changed significantly in the past, but wildly underestimate how much their personality, capabilities, and desires will evolve in the future. At 40, you look back and see how different you were at 30, yet you mistakenly believe that from 40 to 50, your identity will remain completely static. You project your current tired, uninspired state onto your future self, entirely forgetting the transformative power of systemic daily compound accumulation. A specific experiment or historical story as evidence, the most elegant refutation of this illusion can be found in a famous psychological case study adapted from Japanese minimalist literature, focusing on the existential weight of late-stage mastery. Consider the psychological framework of an individual reaching their 60th year of life. In a documented biographical study of an elder who spent his entire life in corporate servitude, the individual expressed immense grief upon reaching 60 because he had refused to pick up the violin at 40. Believing a 20-year horizon was non-existent, however, upon looking back from the vantage point of age 90, a profound cognitive shift occurred. The individual realized that the span between 60 and 90 was 3 full decades, a duration equal to the entire length of his core professional career. Had he initiated the practice at 60 by 90, he would have possessed 30 years of accumulation, transforming him from a complete novice into a senior master. The tragedy was not the lack of time, but the cognitive inability to perceive the massive expanses of time that exist within the later stages of human life. Long-term consequences. When you fall into the trap of hyperbolic discounting and refuse to plant seeds due to a perceived lack of time, the long-term consequence is the generation of compounded existential debt. Every year you delay an action because you think it will take too long to achieve, you are effectively borrowing comfort from the present and paying for it with massive interest paid in the form of deep, unfixable regret in the future. As the decades roll over, you are forced to watch others who chose to endure the clumsy, awkward beginner phase reap the massive rewards of their compounding returns. You are left with the most toxic realization a human mind can harbor, that the only thing standing between your current mediocrity and a state of absolute mastery was a simple 5-year block of time that you voluntarily threw into the trash out of sheer impatience. Idea 3, the true nature of new beginnings, the myth of instant gratification, a real-life phenomenon. When an individual finally summons the courage to break through the temporal prison of age barriers, they almost immediately collide with a second, far more deceptive psychological wall. They enter a new discipline, whether it is writing, learning a digital architecture skill, or stepping into a gym, with a romantic, highly cinematic expectation of the process. They visualize themselves sitting in a sleek coffee shop, typing effortlessly, or standing on a stage capturing a crowd. But the reality of day one is a cold, clinical slap to the ego. The prose looks childish, the software interface looks alien, and their muscles ache. Within weeks, the initial chemical high of motivation completely evaporates, replaced by a profound sense of self-loathing. They look at their clumsy work, compare it to the polished masterpieces of veterans on social media, and conclude, I am fundamentally a talentless fraud. They interpret the normal friction of learning as definitive proof of their own biological incapacity, oblivious to the fact that they have simply mistaken a necessary evolutionary crucible for an exit sign. A real scientific or psychological concept, this abrupt collapse of execution is explained by the Dunning-Kruger effect, combined with the concept of the valley of despair within the emotional cycle of change. When we first decide to pursue a new path, we experience a state of uninformed optimism. Our dopamine spikes because we overestimate our abilities and wildly underestimate the complexity of the task. However, as soon as we begin actual deliberate practice, we slide down into informed pessimism, rapidly hitting the bottom of the curve, the valley of despair. At this neurological junction, the brain is forced to confront the massive deficit between its current taste and its actual execution capacity. Furthermore, modern digital consumer culture has conditioned our neural circuitry for instant gratification, engineering an expectation that enjoyment should be immediate. When a new endeavor demands heavy cognitive taxation without offering an immediate dopamine reward, the brain perceives this deficit as an error, triggering a strong survival mechanism to abandon the task and return to familiar low-effort habits. Specific experiment or historical case study. To observe the mechanics of this friction, we can look at a famous series of longitudinal studies conducted on skill acquisition and human performance architecture, heavily documented by researchers tracking elite violinists and athletic modern masters. The data consistently revealed a striking cognitive divergence between those who achieved world-class mastery and those who plateaued at mediocrity. When questioned about their early developmental years, mediocre performers reported that they only practiced when they felt a subjective sense of flow or enjoyment, treating emotional inspiration as the primary fuel for their labor. Conversely, the elite group viewed the early stages of practice as an explicitly grueling, non-enjoyable physiological requirement. They treated inspiration not as a prerequisite, but as a rare byproduct of sustained, disciplined suffering. They developed what neuroscientists call an effort-reward recalibration. They train their brains to find a secondary form of satisfaction not in the final product, but in the highly repetitive, agonizing process of correcting minor, painful technical errors every single day, completely independent of their emotional state. Long-term consequences if you refuse to cross the valley of despair. Your long-term psychological destiny is the perpetual novice cycle. You become a chronic hopper of disciplines, an existential tourist who falls in love with the idea of mastery but flees the moment the tax of discipline is levied. Over a lifetime, this habit pattern severely erodes your self-efficacy, the foundational belief in your own ability to succeed. Every time you quit an endeavor because it feels awkward or unrewarding, you actively reinforce a neural pathway of retreat. You condition your brain to believe that you are incapable of enduring long-term cognitive load. Eventually, you find yourself trapped in a permanent state of bitter consumerism, sitting on the sidelines watching others build monumental lives while you comfort your fragile ego by convincing yourself that they simply possessed an innate magical talent that you were locked out of receiving. Idea 4. The anatomy of age crises, the formation of a life lived by habit. A real-life phenomenon. We must now perform an autopsy on the modern phenomenon of life crises. Our email servers and social media feeds are completely saturated with a recurring linguistic pattern, the absolute standardization of human misery attached to specific biological ages. We hear of the crisis of 18, the crisis of 25, the midlife crisis of 40, and the profound depression of retirement. Society treats these predictable breakdowns as if they are inevitable astronomical events, like an eclipse or a changing season, something that simply happens to us. We watch an individual wake up on their 30th birthday and suddenly experience terrifying existential panic because they possess no assets, no deep strategic direction, and feel trapped in a dead-end corporate hierarchy. They look at the mirror in absolute horror, wondering how they arrived at this barren landscape. The truth is as simple as it is brutal. They did not arrive here by accident. They carefully engineered this crisis through half a decade of calculated daily passivity, a real scientific or psychological concept. In psychology, this structural disaster is known as the accumulation of unresolved life tasks, a concept heavily rooted in Erik Erikson's stages of psychosocial development, combined with normative amnesia. Normative amnesia is the psychological tendency to completely forget that predictable future challenges require proactive investment in the present. The human brain is incredibly prone to temporal myopia. It treats the future self as a completely different person, a stranger whose financial, physical, and emotional problems are not our concern today. When an individual reaches the age of 25 and chooses an easy, low-stress, mentally stagnant routine, doing exactly what they are told at a mundane job, spending their evenings seeking superficial entertainment, and refusing to read, learn, or build a specialized skill set, they are actively offloading a massive cognitive and economic debt onto their 30-year-old self. A crisis occurs when the chronological timeline catches up with your structural stagnation. It is the exact moment your illusions can no longer withstand the cold pressure of objective reality. A specific experiment or historical case study. The absolute predictability of this pattern is demonstrated by a classic sociological study tracking the career trajectories and psychological profiles of over 1,000 university graduates over a 15-year period. The researchers divided the cohort into two distinct groups based on their behavioral habits between the ages of 22 and 27. Group A practiced active anticipation. They consistently dedicated 5 to 10 hours a week outside of their formal employment to acquire highly technical secondary skills, read deeply across disciplines, and build strategic networks. Group B practiced passive adaptation. They performed adequately at their current jobs, but spent all their remaining cognitive energy on immediate lifestyle comfort and consumer entertainment. For the first 4 years, both groups looked identical from an outside perspective. They earned similar salaries and lived in similar apartments. However, upon hitting the age of 30, the data experienced a violent, nonlinear divergence. Group B experienced an overwhelming wave of existential crises, clinical burnout, and economic stagnation, as their skills had been completely commoditized or replaced. Group A, meanwhile, bypassed the crisis entirely. Their accumulated micro-advantages crystallized into senior executive positions, financial freedom, and an intense sense of autonomy. Group B looked at Group A and called them lucky, completely blind to the 5-year invisible investment that prevented the catastrophe. Long-term consequences. The systemic long-term consequence of living a passive life is the normalization of existential atrophy. If you survive a crisis by simply numbing the pain rather than fixing the structural root, your brain enters a state of permanent defensive crouch. You develop a psychological armor of cynicism to protect your ego from your own unrealized potential. You begin to look at high achievers with intense resentment, labeling their discipline as an obsession and their success as a privilege. By the time you reach retirement, the crisis changes from an acute, painful shock into a permanent icy blanket of absolute despair. You realize that your entire life was spent performing a slow, systematic liquidation of your potential in exchange for temporary comfort. You are left sitting in an empty room, fully conscious of the terrifying truth that you didn't actually live a full life. You merely repeated one single, uninspired, comfortable year 80 times over. Idea 5, the retirement crisis and the late life question of personal identity and self-worth, a real-life phenomenon, the final and perhaps most devastating structural trap of the passive timeline occurs at the absolute twilight of an individual's career. Consider a senior executive or a highly respected professional who has spent 40 years operating within the frantic, hyper-accelerated engine of a corporate hierarchy. Their phone rings incessantly, Their calendar is an absolute battlefield of appointments, and an army of subordinates hangs on their every word. They are treated as an irreplaceable pillar of their industry. Then a single date on a calendar arrives, a formal dinner is held, a gold watch is presented, and they are handed their retirement papers. Within 24 hours, the noise stops completely. The emails cease, the authority vanishes, and they are left standing in a profoundly silent house. Within months, an outside observer will notice a shocking physical and mental degradation. This individual, who was once a titan of productivity, begins to sink into a deep, immovable lethargy or a state of chronic clinical depression, staring at their garden with an expression of absolute emptiness. A real scientific or psychological concept. This psychological collapse is known as role identity fusion combined with the hedonic vacuum. Role identity fusion occurs when an individual fails to maintain a psychological boundary between their authentic self and their institutional title. Over decades of repetition, their brain undergoes an intense neural consolidation. They do not perceive themselves as a human being who performs engineering or management. They perceive themselves as the manager. Their self-worth, ego stability, and neurological reward systems become entirely dependent on external validation, corporate status, and structural busyness. When the institution cuts them loose, the brain experiences a massive catastrophic drop in dopamine and serotonin production, plunging into a hedonic vacuum. Because they spent their entire adult lives adaptationally reacting to external demands rather than proactively cultivating an independent inner architecture, they possess no internal mechanism to generate meaning in the absence of a corporate checklist. A specific experiment or historical case study, the brutal reality of this psychological dynamic was starkly illuminated in a landmark multi-decade longitudinal study tracking the mortality rates and cognitive decline of over 10,000 high-status professionals post-employment. The data uncovered a terrifying physiological correlation. Individuals who experienced rapid, unnavigated retirement without prior psychological restructuring showed a threefold increase in cardiovascular events and accelerated cognitive dementia within the first 36 months of leaving their positions. Conversely, a tiny subset of the cohort showed zero decline, instead experiencing a massive surge in vitality, longevity, and creative output. When the researchers dissected the habits of this resilient anomaly group, they discovered a fascinating pattern of parallel identity building initiated decades prior. These individuals, starting as early as age 35 or 40, had systematically invested time in building deeply technical, non-monetized secondary identities. They were corporate directors by day, but master chess strategists, deep-sea historians, or artisanal woodworkers by night. They did not retire from a position. They transitioned into a long-awaited, fully constructed intellectual empire that they had been meticulously assembling in the shadows for 30 years. Long-term consequences. The long-term consequence of failing to separate your identity from your employment is the disintegration of the self. When you allow your career to consume your entire existential real estate, your retirement becomes an execution chamber for your consciousness. You spend your remaining years looking backward, constantly retelling ancient stories of your past corporate glory to anyone who will listen, fully aware that you are currently irrelevant. You become an empty shell, a ghost haunting your own living body, trapped in the ultimate psychological tragedy, realizing too late that you spent your entire life building an empire for a corporation, while leaving your own mind a completely barren, uninhabitable wasteland. Idea 6, the ultimate solution, the mindset of active creation and the strategy of long-term persistence. A real-life phenomenon. To break out of this systemic multi-generational trap, we must witness an absolute, uncompromising revolution in how an individual manages their daily cognitive energy. Look at the tiny fraction of humanity that operates in a state of permanent creative evolution. The individuals who change industries at 40, write masterpieces at 60, and maintain a blazing, infectious curiosity until their final breath. From the outside, society looks at them and attributes their success to a genetic anomaly, an extraordinary reservoir of willpower, or an elusive concept called genius. But if you bypass the mythology and audit their actual calendar, you find a remarkably boring, highly mechanistic, and thoroughly unromantic truth. They do not wait for inspiration, they do not consult their emotional states, and they do not ask society for permission to pivot. They operate on an explicit system of daily microscopic execution that is completely insulated from the opinions of the world. A real scientific or psychological concept, this bulletproof operational state is achieved by practicing radical autonomy through microstochastic accumulation and the mental model of temporal decoupling. Radical autonomy requires you to completely sever the neural feedback loop between your behavior and immediate external validation. You transition from a reactive organism to a proactive force. Microstochastic accumulation leverages the mathematical power of compound interest applied to human capability. By dedicating just 60 minutes a day, a mere 4% of your total daily allocation, to deep, deliberate practice of a complex skill, you are forcing your brain to undergo systemic neuroplastic remodeling. Over a 5-year horizon, this calculation yields over 1,800 hours of pure, concentrated cognitive labor. Because your competition is operating on a timeline of immediate gratification and social comparison, your 5-year compound strategy effectively places you in a completely different evolutionary bracket, rendering you utterly unassailable. A a specific experiment or historical case study. The most profound historical validation of this compounding model is found in the architectural records of classical polymaths during the European scientific revolution. Consider the operational habits of thinkers who made foundational contributions to physics, mathematics, and art simultaneously. Society viewed them as divinely inspired, but their personal diaries tell a drastically different story. They divided their days into rigid, mathematically calculated blocks. They practice what modern cognitive scientists call deep work isolation. A famous case study involved an academic who, while working a grueling, highly demanding administrative job to survive, committed to writing exactly 2 high-density pages of an advanced theoretical treatise every single morning before sunrise. If he had an emotional crisis, he wrote 2 pages. If he was physically exhausted, he wrote 2 pages. If the country was at war, he wrote 2 pages. Within 7 years, this invisible daily microscopic discipline culminated in a massive multi-volume masterpiece that permanently reshaped the trajectory of human thought. His peers, who spent those same 7 years complaining about their heavy administrative workloads and their lack of free time, looked at his monumental achievement in absolute astonishment, completely unable to comprehend how a single human being could produce such a massive volume of work in the shadows. Long-term consequences. When you adopt the framework of radical autonomy and commit to the 5-year horizon of microstochastic accumulation, your long-term psychological outcome is the absolute attainment of generative autonomy. You completely immunize yourself against chronophobia and the existential dread of aging, because you possess a proven, repeatable internal mechanism to convert raw time into high-value skill and profound personal meaning. You no longer look at the future with anxiety or a sense of impending limitation. Instead, you look at every coming decade as a massive, thrilling arena for new territory acquisition. You reach the end of your lifespan not with a long list of agonizing, unexecuted dreams, but with a profound, quiet pride, looking back at a life that was meticulously, intentionally, and brilliantly engineered by your own hands. The illusion of the universal timeline is officially shattered. You now stand at the ultimate psychological crossroads of your life. You can choose to close this video, slide back into the warm, comforting anesthesia of your daily routine, and allow your age to remain your primary excuse for mediocrity. Or, you can choose to accept the terrifying responsibility of your own potential, step into the cold friction of the beginner phase, and begin building an empire in the shadows today. The time will pass regardless of your choice. 5 years from this exact moment, you will be half a decade older. The only question that matters is, who will you be when you get there? If you are ready to sever your relationship with comfort and join the rare minority who dictates their own evolutionary timeline, type the exact word equity in the comments section below. Let it stand as an indelible public digital contract between your current self and the master version of you that is waiting 5 years in the future. Subscribe to Shadow Psychology, and we will see you in the next breakdown.